Hello and welcome. Here we are at week 4 of our class. And this week, we're going to be looking at chapters 9 and 10. And I want to give a little talking about particularly chapter 9, uh, which is about mutual support groups. Let's see, the exact title is Mutual Self-Help Groups and Spiritual Religious Resources. And when for years, when we talked about mutual support groups, really what we were talking about was AA, NA, and all the other 12-step groups. You have specialized groups, Cocaine Anonymous, you have Methadone Anonymous meetings for people who are in methadone treatment and want to attend 12-step meetings where you're not judged for being on methadone. Uh, and the 12-step groups really have been fantastic for people who are in recovery. However, they do not work for everyone. And the problem has been that we have tried over time to force people into programs that don't necessarily work for them. So, luckily, over time, we have had a lot of options available. And what I have put on Moodle here, we're going to take a look at together through the Miracle of Zoom, is to look at some of the, there we go, look at some of the different groups that are available. For the 12-step groups, I just stuck with Alcoholics Anonymous. And we will see that, of course, right now, every website you go to has updates on coronavirus, things like that. So, what is good about the website is, first of all, it gives you links to what's new, read the daily reflections, make a contribution, going to the online bookstore, uh, the virtual international convention, regional forums. You can go down here, you can put in your zip code and country, and you could get links to where local meetings are, what is AA for professionals, for AA members. So all the information that you could possibly want about AA. Uh, right now, obviously, with COVID, a lot of meetings are actually virtual meetings. Uh, you find very few in-person meetings. Uh, in the town of Brookfield, not far from where I live, I understand there is a meeting that's been going on in the town common at noon every day, weekdays. Uh, I would think it would be a little harder to be anonymous sitting in the town common. However, I think a lot of times people are much more concerned about maintaining their sobriety than they are in maintaining their anonymity. And we don't have as much stigma around addiction now as there was back in the 1930s. AA was formed. So the 12-step groups, as I say, have been around forever. They work for a lot of people. Some people, however, do have difficulty with the spiritual aspect. And you need to remember that AA really grew out of the Oxford group, which was an evangelical Christian group in the 1930s. And the 12 steps are taken very much from the teachings of the Oxford group. So even though they do attempt to stay spiritual but not religious, some religious terminologies and the like do creep into it enough to make some people uncomfortable. So over time, other groups have been developed to try to help people. And one of the older ones is Smart Recovery. And we will bring that website up. Smart Recovery grew out of Rational Recovery. Rational Recovery was a approach to addiction treatment that had a group format, sort of a mutual help format that was developed in the 1980s, I believe it was, by a guy named Jack Trimpe. Uh, Mr. Trimpe, however, did have some personality quirks. And after a while, what he decided was he wanted Rational Recovery to be a paid seminar type of thing. A lot of people who were finding sobriety through Rational Recovery did not particularly want to uh, get involved in that. So they broke off their own group and came up with the name Smart Recovery, which you can see here. It stands for Self-Management and Recovery Training. The interesting thing is that they came up with the word smart first and then decided what the letters would stand for. With Smart Recovery, you will find they are very much involved in doing uh, statistics and in proving that they are an evidence-based program. One of the things they did, because it's a much smaller organization, you don't find as many smart recovery meetings around. There has been one at Cole's Place in Springfield at noon on Tuesdays. I think right now that has been a virtual meeting due to COVID. I'm sure once things get back to where you can, and for them it's going to be a little more difficult because it is a recovery home. Uh, they're going to have to look at what's best for the people in the recovery home before they open it up to outsiders coming in for smart recovery meetings. But smart, uh, you can see what we do, who we serve, resources. Uh, Again, they have a very strong online presence, and they have done research that proves that the online meetings are as effective as in-person meetings, which really has been good news, not only for them, but again, in this time of COVID, it's been good for everybody to have that ability to uh, offer some virtual meetings so that things aren't totally shut down and people are not on their own. Another more recent group is Recovery Dharma. And Recovery Dharma is based on Buddhist practices and principles. Uh, Again, I'm sure they would tell you that they are spiritual and not religious, as technically Buddhism is a spiritual path and not necessarily a religion. However, that doesn't mean people have not turned it into one. But again, a lot of people have found these meetings to be very handy. Here you can find a local meeting. Uh, so we'll go back. You can find online meetings, so on and so forth. Uh, I have worked with a number of people who have found this to be very helpful. A lot of work on mindfulness and kind of letting go. So again, people find that very helpful. Um, Another group that's been around for a while is Celebrate Recovery. And when that comes up, we will see that Celebrate Recovery bills itself, here it comes, Christ-centered 12-step program. So they do work off the 12 steps. However, they also have much more of a Christian focus to their work. And again, you will find how do I find a Celebrate Recovery? Is it for me? How to attend the Summit Online and Training Conference? So again, people have told me who have attended that the meetings would often begin with a potluck dinner. And then after the potluck dinner, they would break into various groups according to what type of uh, addiction you might have, be it gambling or substance or whatever it might be. So going back, another group that's been around for a good while is Secular Organizations for Sobriety, which again, like uh, Smart Recovery, was formed by people who did not want anything that smacked of spirituality or religion. Uh, I personally, in my early days working in the addiction field, felt like a lot of times I was expected more to help people have a spiritual experience so they could get with the AA program than I was working with them to change their lives so that they could have long lasting sobriety. And again, I'm not knocking the 12-step approach, but it is not for everyone. People do need to have uh, those opportunities for other things. You can see again, there's about news information, find a meeting. I don't think there are any meetings local to us, but I could be wrong on that. Then there's Women for Sobriety, which is another of the older groups. And again, with a lot of these groups, other than AA, you find that they do not have as large a presence. Uh, they have a series of acceptance statements. I have a life-threatening problem that once had me. Now take charge of my life and well-being. I accept responsibility, which you can see is sort of a play on step one of the 12 steps, but it is kind of like a beginning point for most people. So if we sat here long enough, it would start going through all the different statements. Really worth looking at. And again, here's about the New Life program, meetings, shopping. Uh, it's been around for a long time. It was founded by I can't remember if she was a social worker or a sociologist. Uh, and you know, women in particular, especially in the early days, uh, found that a lot of 12-step meetings were male dominated and sometimes felt very uncomfortable. Uh, Unfortunately, sometimes women in support groups feel like they can be objectified or preyed upon by some of the male members. So it's kind of difficult for them sometimes, which is why AA and NA in places will have women's meetings. But Women for Sobriety was sort of designed particularly address that and to also couch things in terms that women more kind of reacted to. Um, so then we have the last one we'll look at is life ring secular sobriety. This is a group. I did I spoke at a conference uh, presenting my positive path recovery approach to addiction treatment uh, at the NADAC National Conference in Overland Park, Kansas. And the Life Ring Secular Recovery, which had a large presence in that area, had a table. And that was the first time I became aware of it. But, again, they avoid the sort of spiritual religious aspects. And for people who either don't have a spiritual background, or for people who have spiritual trauma related around church or religious issues, this is, you know, groups like this be very important. So the thing to really remember is that it's not so much important which group a person uses, actually, even if they use it. I think it's wonderful to suggest it to people. I think it's wonderful to give them options and invite them. But not everybody is comfortable in groups. Not everybody benefits from sort of a open sharing type of thing. Uh, if you have trust issues, uh, you may be very unlikely to want to share. If you are an introvert, if you are a person who doesn't really like being around groups of people, forcing support group participation, I feel, can be very counterproductive. So, uh, there are other ways that people can get support in sobriety, but there's no doubting that this is important. As far as spiritual, uh, again, if I can find the terms that they use here, uh, spiritual religious resources, I have always looked at where a person is coming from. And if I am working with a client who has a very spiritual or religious background and basis, then we work with that. And it's a great building block, it's a great foundation for their recovery. But again, uh, you do not have to have it in order to recover. So I, before I recommend any support group to a client, I like to really kind of get a feel for where they are at and what their background is, how they react to various ideas before I would recommend a particular group for them to attend. Another thing I will say about 12-step groups, B.F. Skinner, the behavioral psychologist who is rather famous for his experiments with rats and the Skinner box that he would use for a lot of these experiments. For whatever reason, came up with a humanist 12 steps, and he rewrote the 12 steps in a totally non-religious, non-spiritual manner. And what I have frequently done with clients who are resistant to the 12-step approach, but kind of feel like they still need to go to the meetings. I have given them or gotten them to go online and find the Humanist 12 Steps by V.F. Skinner. And I tell them while you're at the meeting, when they're talking about a step, they're reading it in the way it was written back in the 1930s. But in their mind, they repeat the step, they know it from the Skinner 12 steps. And people find that very helpful. So, chapter 10 really is talking about family risks and resiliency. There's no doubt that addiction can have a family component. First of all, we see cases where addiction runs in a family. My family, for instance, my parents both died in their mid 60s due to complications from alcoholism. And I also lost my younger brother and my younger sister to complications due to alcoholism. I was the one person in the family who dodged that bullet, but I know that that propensity is there. And if I'm not careful, I could be there. So, on the other hand, when I met my wife, I remember the first date we went on, she ordered a drink with dinner. And when we were leaving the restaurant, I just happened to notice that she had half the drink sitting there. And I remember thinking, nobody in my family ever left half a drink, unless maybe they had fallen off the bar stool and couldn't get back up to finish it. But so that struck me as odd. Then, as we began to date more, and she brought me from Baltimore up to Massachusetts here to visit her family. They had a big family get together, and there were like about 30 people there. And somebody brought a 12-pack of beer. At the end of the day, when I was helping to clean up, there were about 4 or 5 unopened cans in the 12-pack. And a couple of cans that were sitting around on picnic tables were half empty. And, again, that struck me as odd because that wouldn't happen in my family. So, it doesn't guarantee that you will or will not have a problem, but the chances are definitely increased. Part of it is no doubt due to some genetic problems, something in the brain that, the shut-off valve that says that's enough. Or it could be perhaps social learning. If you learn that the way you have fun is to drink, then that's what you learn to do. And that's kind of how you act. So, then there's also no doubt that addiction affects family members. Uh, Part of it can be financial. I remember a lot of times waiting for my father to come home from work on payday so we could go out and buy groceries. And he would not get home until after the bar closed, and he would not have his full paycheck. I can also remember the problems it caused between my mother and my father. I can remember the arguments, the fights, and these things have an impact. I remember one time that was very noisy downstairs with my parents yelling at each other and probably throwing a few plates and glasses across the kitchen. And then it got real quiet. And that actually scared me more than the fighting. And I came downstairs and I looked in the kitchen, and my father was holding this broken whiskey bottle. My mother had a knife and they were facing off. So, needless to say, this sort of has an effect on you as you grow up. Uh, they they talk about the role theory in this chapter, uh, and they talk about the various roles. There's the chemically dependent person who is sort of the center of all this. There's the family manager, the person who tries to keep everything going. There's a hero, the person in the family who's trying to save the family. There's a scapegoat, the one who gets blamed for a lot of the problems, even though the problem really is the chemically dependent person. There's the lost child, the one who is sort of off on their own, avoiding the family drama, living in their own little world. And then the mascot, sort of the clown of the family. And looking back, I can see times when I played a lot of these roles, and it affects people. Uh, I grew up uh, being very codependent because I felt pretty unlikable, and I felt like the only reason a person would want to be with me is if I were doing something for them. And it really led to a lot of bad relationships, bad marriages. Uh, Thankfully, I got into therapy along the way, and thankfully, before I met my my wife now, and things are a whole lot better. But it does have an effect on the whole family. Uh, Again, financially, and particularly with gambling addiction. You'll hear a lot of times where a person loses their home, they lose their car, they lose their job. Uh, and again, with gambling disorder, you do have a higher rate of suicide. And a lot of times people are finding out that they're losing their home and their car, and at the same time dealing with suicide of the person who is responsible for it. So, then, you've got all this anger that can't even be expressed to the person, and then feeling that sense of loss. So it's very, very difficult. So those are the chapters this week. I will be posting the discussion question shortly. Don't forget to continue to work on the motivational interviewing assignment, and we'll talk to you next week. Have a great week.